Hi everyone, I'm Janko. We're going to talk about sports motion. So just before we start, um, yeah, if there are any people live, you can obviously send questions. You can also message me on Facebook because there is slight possibility that this group chat is not going to work. You can also ask me later anything you want, etc. So before we jump into talking about it, just the aim of this workshop is basically it is two things. So thing number one is we're going to try to locate most common mistakes made by people, in my opinion, when debating sports motions. And secondly, discuss some concepts about sports motion, how to use them, and why sports motions are not that much about sports, but rather about stuff that people generally like that you know when you use in debates and some other just on some other topics, right? So um, yeah, we're going to talk about those stuff at the end. Like the last half an hour, maybe 20 minutes, we're probably going to talk about some stuff that does not appear that often in debates, though may appear in some very sports specific debates. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. So most of sports motions are basically um, somehow linked to redistribution, profit incentives, stuff like that. So for instance, if you take round three of Dutch Worlds, it was detailed belief that sports leagues should significantly tax and redistribute from wealthier teams to poor teams. More severe motion was, I think this house should write the commercialization of football or sports. Um, I also debated in some international motions such as this house would nationalize all football clubs and stuff like that. I mean, obviously there can be motions which about sports which do not include those kinds of clashes, right? But I think most commonly it is some form of redistribution, um, some form of like fixing profit incentives and regulations versus like let it go with the flow, free market conceptions of sports, etc. So I think that in order for this workshop to be like to be useful to in order for it to fit in like hour and a half or however much time we have, we are mostly going to talk about these kinds of about some kind of regulation in sports. So um, just just to begin with, like we can use the motion which is redistribution, significantly taxing the distribute from wealthier teams and poor teams. It's a very common motion, right? So regarding those kinds of motions, firstly, what I want to address is that there are two framings that people use in these debates and often get away with it. Not like the best strategy to use in sports debates because because other teams are not very. One thing is talking about the quality of the game itself. To make arguments, look, this is going to like decrease the amount of money that's in football. It is going to players are going to get less. It's less money. It's going to become less professional. So football or basketball or any other sports is going to be like for watching. It's going to harm the audience. It's also going to produce harm in terms of like it's going to be less money. Investors are not going to invest. Sponsorships, blah blah blah. All those other stuff, right? So the problem with this claim is that I think it's easily rebutted with the fact that okay, so maybe football is going to become less quality. It does not mean that it's going to like make some viewers because like if you watch football from let's say I don't know 1960s, 1970s, like Brazil was dominating, etc., and you watch football nowadays, if we would have time machine and put those players versus I don't know today's Real Madrid team, like the modern football team would probably destroy the previous. Like it wouldn't be even close. Like medical conditioning, coaching, tactics, like sport is advancing that way, right? And you should basically agree with it. But it does not mean that the football in the 70s or 60s was less entertaining or that it could have like less sponsorship, etc. Because of the simple fact that it is very hard to pass the eye test, whether someone is so good or so not good. So for instance, when you just watch football in like, when you don't see the kids, the uniforms, which is like the top Premier League clubs, and watch the game between the bottom Premier League clubs, you probably wouldn't notice that much of a difference, right? And you can also add on that, like, okay, but when football was bigger, it might have been even more entertaining because we had more goals, it was generally more offensive, more entertaining. Players didn't have money, so they like cared less. You had more like dribbling, stuff like that. So just by the fact that like overall players are not gonna work that hard, etc., does not mean it's gonna be less entertaining. So all of the implications and impacts that are derived from the fact that the quality is going to be decreased are a lot weakened. And the other thing that I think people use often get away with it is talking about racism in sports and how sports can either solve problems of racism in some way help it, or in some way it can become worse. So I think the issue with running those kinds of cases on sports motions is that when you think of it, it's really hard to imagine that the motion about the distribution is going to have such an implication, right? So, for instance, you can run, okay, sports clubs are going to have less money, so when sports clubs have less money, they're going to be less likely to, they're going to be less likely to buy players from other countries, and these players may be people of color. For instance, there are many players from all around Western Africa who are playing in French league. Obviously, make an analysis about when you watch football and see people of color or people of different religion and stuff like that. Because you like a football club, you're going to like those people now, and somehow they're going to have less racism in our society. So this with this, one is that like that argumentation, which is like the players are going to have clubs going to have less money, they're going to be less likely to import players from rest of the world, and they're going to be just domestic players. I'm not sure that is like necessarily true. By the simple fact that it is not at all expensive. A lot of players from Western Africa, because usually when clubs sign contracts with these players, those players are extremely young, and they usually start in their youth academies. So it is actually like extremely cheap for them to do that, and perhaps like even if they have less money, they may be even more inclined to do that because like you don't have to pay anything. You can just like offer people some amount of money, like somewhere to live and stuff like that. Especially because like those are usually people who come from like extremely poor areas. So basically, the status quo is going to still hold up because it's not that expensive at all. So if they get less money, they're probably going to cut their expenses somewhere else, like somewhere where expenses are actually huge and enormous. And the other thing is that I think it's really hard to make like a significant impact on the point of like, for instance, I don't know if for Millwall Football Club we have more black players, you're going to have less racism. I just think that like you can rebut it with the way that like reasons why racism exists in these communities is probably a lot deeper social problem. It's that's extremely tough to be solved by like more, let's say, but like, you can also have playing for other teams, like teams you hate, so you can just hate on them, jokes about them, racial slurs, stuff like that, which is happening in status quo. So I think that like it is really hard to draw implications from these two types of cases because like there are many burdens that you need to prove, and if only one step falls apart, basically all of the implications are contingent upon understanding in those debates. Obviously, that is not to say that like you should never run those kinds of stuff in sports motions. I just think that often the way people run it can be not that good, not a good choice of a strategy. There are obviously some debates about sports where that can be a major clash and stuff like that, like regulation of sports debates. I think they're just stuff which you can frame as more important or more impactful than these 2 points. I think people often run. So yeah. So now I'm going to talk about frames, concepts that you're supposed to talk about, in my opinion, in sports debates. Um, and you're just going to like link them to the specifics of the motion, whether it's commercialization, it's regulation, it's salary cap, whatever the motion is about. So those three things are technically like how to frame what is the most important issue of the debate. And I think like three main things are: one, the satisfaction of viewers, of fans, and how like football is supposed to provide football, sports, whatever. It's supposed to provide happiness to the world and to everyone who's watching it, entertainment, which should make people happy. That's the most important stuff. Second one is about labor rights of the players, and why it is important for players to have money, to have mobility, why they the most significant stakeholder in this debate. And the third one is like broader economy, like how football creates enormous economic value, jobs, stuff like that. And that's like significantly important because it affects lots of people, takes people out of poverty, creates jobs, and whatever else. So let's jump. And fourth like concept is like legitimacy of regulating football, because that can also occur in debate. So let's just deal with legitimacy in football, right? So let's say we're having a motion about massive redistribution from which of the football club. So I think what people like oftentimes miss in these debates is that op can basically run a line which says radical distribution is immoral, full stop, right? And it may seem like a bad argument because we're not talking about sports. But actually, when you think of it, it does not have to be a bad argument at all. We're all the time having the debates about redistribution. Probably one of the first debates many people have ever debated was discount reports, right? For redistribution, or discount for tax, which some motions like that, right? So basically, like all the principal arguments that stand in that debate, which I believe that many people know conceptually, know how to make them, know how to run them, may also apply to this, right? I like property rights, like linking it to your body integrity, like whatever principle line you want to run, why I think that redistribution will be bad. You can also run in football cases, like football clubs are owned by people and you're taking away money from someone, blah blah blah. So there is an argument about like legitimizing redistribution that are taking money away from billionaires who own football clubs, which is to say, it's like the simplest of concepts like when we talk about lottery of birth, right? The only thing that you're not going to talk about literal lottery of birth, but rather like the lottery of formations of football clubs, because like football clubs have begun their journey in very different occasions, which are very arbitrary. For instance, like which city you're in, right? Whether you're a football club from London or you're a football club from some small town in northwestern England, you're probably having different like different starting points, or for instance, like which part of the town you're living, or for instance, at which period past were you was your club founded, or for instance, in many parts of the world, how the fact that government or like either directly or through government-owned companies pump money into certain football clubs to satisfy the population which was cheering for them. They created this kind of quickly selfish stuff. But like all government pumps money in this club, so that club was good, the fact that that club was good means that they have a lot of fans in the 1930s, and when they have fans, then their children have fans, and these clubs were like in this proportional advantage and stuff like that, right? So if your case is like on football, your redistribution case on government, but attack those type of traditional saying like redistribution is like immoral. Obviously, there is a way to say like like, okay, it is immoral, but like in some instances to distribute, it is just to take utility, but also you can just legitimize it by running like low CNK, full scale, lottery birth of football cards. So just one note, I would not suggest running this as like positive material. I think it's like this legitimization of redistributing and taking money from football cards to another should be used mostly as a negative argument to rebut the point coming from opposition that goes like the opposition of this money because it's somehow principle. So let's go into first of the three concepts we said we're going to talk about. And the first one, which I think is like the most difficult for people to get, especially if they do not watch football or do not hang out with people who are watching football, is like the overall happiness from society or how to please the fans, etc. etc. So what I'm going to do is just run through lines of argumentation about satisfying fans, why that is the most important criteria, and then we're going to talk about how you should actually link that stuff we're talking about, obviously on which motion we're speaking about regarding sports debates. So you want to say that like the metric, the criteria judging the debate is in which term we're going to be like, let's say the most hardcore fans. So generally like fans who find sports really important. Who find sports really important for them, etc. etc. So why these people are most important, right? So the first line we should run is the same as we previously talked, the lottery and birth, or the fact that you didn't have agency, you didn't have a free will when you were choosing whether you're going to be a fan of this or that football club, right? Technically, you have been coerced into being a fan of a certain football club, right? So, for instance, whether like whether your parents, your father or mother were fans of a football club is probably going to strongly determine whether you're going to cheer for that club or not. The town you were born, the city you were born, or secondly, like the part of the city you were born. If you were born in northern London or southern London, this probably affects which London football club you're going to cheer for. But also, like if you're going to be football fan as well, also kind of depends on football stuff. Like I remember me being 5 years old and father taking me to a football game. Definitely strongly affected my childhood and kind of I was fan of sports as well. So very often like it's kind of family tradition and like the subculture that runs in a family to be a fan of a football club. But also the school you used to go in, right? Also depending on the neighborhood you're living at. How that may determine which club you're cheering for, like are your friends fans of a certain club or not? Do you want to adapt to that? Do you want to switch, etc., etc. How generally like, there's huge peer pressure, especially among like, boys in primary school to be fans of football club, to love football, it's so masculine, it's so cool, etc. etc. So basically all those lines of organization of the fans to be coerced into being like a fan of a football club. Then second to that, I think there is a line which is important for football debate, and is explaining how and to what extent football actually matters to those people. And I think this is part of the cases where people often struggle with. People don't watch sports or hang out with people who watch sports, like understanding why it matters so much. So this is something that I think we should like spend a bit more time talking about, right? So I think the way you should look at people who are like really hardcore fans of football is like being a huge part of one's identity, right? So many debaters are very good at debating identity politics stuff. They understand it very well. Like when we're talking about religion, nationalism, like whatever we're talking about. I think the way you should look at someone being a fan of a certain football club is also like give it a shot at something being really important for people. Even if you don't understand it at all, that's something that really matters. And why? Well, because like there are many factors which like determine what kind of subculture you're parting if you're a fan of a certain football club. So for instance, right, we used to talk about neighborhoods, local patriotism. Like I don't know if this may be issue in the countries or cities you're coming from, but generally people also like tend to be very locally patriotic, like this part of the town is better than that one, my place is better than yours, etc., etc. Especially when you're young, and how that like kind of continues to work even when you grow older. Secondly, like family heritage. Like you say, look, my father, my mother were cheering for that club, my grandfathers and grandmothers were cheering for that club. Oh, they used to be on a game in 1965 when my club was playing that club in Janko and stuff, etc. So it can be like a huge part of the family heritage, especially for like closely tight families where you find those kind of things important. Like second is like the political connotation of you being a fan of certain football club or not. Like for instance, in all of Eastern Europe, you may have like regime clubs, right? Communist or socialist regime clubs, which the regime was pumping money into. And you may also have like the previous royalist club, or if there was like monarchy, like and kind of democratic state before that. People very often link the history and the way the club was founded to like certain political aspects of it. So this club may be for rich, this club may be for poor, this club is socialist, this club is monarchist, etc. And but the sheer fact that people tend to have like very strong political views on this issue is like kind of that spills over like into like cheering for the football club and also hating the other football club because that football club represents something that you, for instance, hate in society. I think that's like the symbolism of football club is what it creates like that strong identification with person that person has with the club, right? Also like the some kind of history of conflicts, right? It can be about religion, it's like oh this is a Protestant club, this is a Catholic club, or this is Orthodox club, this is Catholic club, or also like if you have cities which are more diverse, like ethnically diverse or racially diverse. We can have, for instance, in Moscow, which is a city in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have like these huge clashes where one club, Zrinski, is like perceived, not perceived, but technically ethnically Croatian club, while Belgrade is like ethnically Bosnian club. We also have like the tension between Muslim and Catholic religion, so people take these things very seriously. Like generally, all those stuff that matter to people and that you realize there's like intuitive eye matters to people, like religion, nationality, ethnicity, race, all those cultural stuff, they just apply to people. In that like symbolic way, people to like equalize with the body some parts of culture that matter to them, like really strongly. As a matter of fact, sometimes like you being a fan of a football club and that being part of your identity can even outweigh some other identities, which intuitively may also be very important. So, for instance, like people who love sports and are like strong supporters of a certain football club may watch like a national team and hate on the players who are from the opposing club. So, like when you're like watching a national your national team in football playing someone, you like when you look at the fans, they often tend to have like slurs at their own players who are just playing for the opposing club. So, for instance, like there was a game I think Serbia was playing France national team games. For 90 minutes, Serbian fans were like screaming like horrible things at Serbian goalkeeper who used to play for Red Star but now plays for Partizan. Right? Like even though you're watching a national team game and you're supposed to be other nation, You're still using like 90 minutes of your voice just to make someone of your club or of your national team feel that. Um, just just think of that in those terms. You can also use those examples in the base, obviously, just to explain how much it matters to people when it comes when it comes to football. So those are generally, I think, the lines that explain like the extent of importance of football clubs, sports clubs in general to people. Now that being said, obviously that is not close argument. That's I think mostly part of the framing. If you want to frame the debate as this is what matters, this is what matters the most. Right? We should make people happy. Those people who are crying when they're football. Poor people who are willing to spend £200 just to watch just to watch their football club play. They're traveling across the world and spending enormous amounts of money like, just to watch their players. Etc. These are people who really matter. Also, I think that part of the frame, if you want to frame the debate that way, should be like, okay, debate is not about the other stuff, and that's the other stuff we're going to talk about later. So, however, everything we've talked about at this point is, I think that you should constantly have in your mind when debating football decisions, because the tough part of creating case, I think, comes after that. So, if you want to frame debate, it's important for those times. Now it comes to what are the specifics of the motion we're talking about. So, if you're speaking about like regretting commercialization of football, or if you're speaking about like, radical redistribution of wealth among football clubs, you're going to have different mechanisms how those things harm these specific people. If you want to debate about like let's talk about the distribution of wealth, right? And you frame the debate is like these are the people who might so the fact that your club is so significantly poorer than the other clubs like harms those individuals. For instance, your club may be forced to sell like homegrown players that fans are like really fond of. They really like so talented, so young. But in order for that club to remain financially stable, they just need to sell very good young players to the other clubs. But also, those young and good and talented players tend to want to leave their club because they want to make more money. They want to be like more commercial. They want to have more personal sponsorships. They want to have greater salary. They want to have longer contracts. They just want to have greater financial stability, which may be provided to them by all the other clubs. And then explain how, because of all the things we've talked about, how football is part of their identity or very important subculture. Those exist homegrown players are very important to them. They like hope that your club maybe do someday better, etc. But those clubs are however forced to sell them. Powerful clubs such as Chelsea, who are very rich, was not forced to sell John Terry or Frank Lampard for the majority of their careers because they couldn't sustain the cost because like economical scale of clubs is so big that something it may even pay off just to keep players fans like even if the player is bad. Even if the player is bad, right, and stuff like that. But secondly, like those like smaller poorer clubs may, for instance, have the tickets which are like higher than for let's say Manchester United fans because like the revenue that they get from ticket sales has a lot larger weight than when we talk about Manchester United. Because Manchester United earns, I think in 2015 the number was 866 million pounds just based on sponsorship. Right? So Adidas, AON, which I know that is, Chevrolet, like all those things combined are 866 million pounds for 1 year. Obviously, World Cup do not have the ability to earn money from those kind of stuff, so they have when you sell tickets, and when you sell the tickets, you tend to pump up prices. So only like the richer people are going to be the ones who are going to be able to afford to pay tickets, while also the poor ones maybe like out of ticket. Many of those like poor people who cannot afford to go to games uh, are exactly the people we're talking about, right? The people for whom football and their club matters the most. Um, so you can link it that way. So the point of that is like we could go like all up in depth about all the aspects of like how this can how like if you're poor this may affect you. Like most obviously you're going to have like poor performance, you're going to lose more games, you're going to qualify for European leagues where you're going to be performing better than, you're probably going to lose, as I'm going to be said, and cry a lot, you're going to harm those people who are most important, blah blah blah. However, the most important thing is not just to run the line we just talked about and not link it to the metric. Right? So for instance, what can happen like commercialization motion is that people often like just don't include the link between commercialization and harming and harming that. And I think it's like your job in prep time when you're debating sport solutions is so significantly easier if you know and you know by heart or are familiar with the type of training we were just talking about. And then just when you make the arguments, you try to link why specifically commercialization is going to lead to harm to people with right? Because I think like in 15 minutes it gets a lot easier if you just get to make those links and just know you're going to run that stuff out. It's so important to these people. And it's a international identity, but it's stronger than them, the religious identity. You just know that and just think of the links, so how that's very harmful for these people, right? So yeah, we could talk about finding all these links, etc. But I think it's like most of the people are capable of finding them. They just spend too much time thinking about like, oh, what should be run, what should be most important thing and stuff like that. So like to close this point, like the first important thing in football, it matters to the fans. Here is why it matters so much to the fans. And specifically like depending on the motion, how is like this specific policy going to affect it? I think that should be most of their job in your practice. Now the second thing, the second huge thing I want to talk about is generally money. And how money. So I have listed many things about how football clubs actually earn money and how that may be important for the game. So like few things to have. I think it's more like the greatest percentage of money comes actually from sponsorship. So I'll be talking about like Manchester United earning 166 million a year just for sponsorships. However, that statistic also can be very misleading because of like Manchester United as a football club is a huge brand itself, and that's why it can attract that much of a sponsorship. And the proof for that is that even though they were not very good that year, they had more sponsorships than I think Chelsea, Tottenham, Manchester City, and Arsenal combined. So this means like all these clubs had around 200 million in profit in sponsorship deals. However, Manchester had just a lot more because it was so much profitable to advertise yourself as being part of Manchester United rather than Chelsea, City, or any other club, right? So obviously, like you should always have that in mind and how that is information. Huge, enormous amount of money on the sponsorship business. So second part is merchandise, right? So the stuff that your product has, like this intellectual property and for instance, t-shirts, ashtrays with an emblem of your club, the full kit, um, shoes, like all those stuff that you see when you enter the stadium. Arsenal Football Club shop and merchandise from that. So I think people often underestimate that. In the days, for instance, I remember reading the statistic that when Cristiano Ronaldo was bought by Real Madrid for, I believe, 93 million euros from Manchester United, they managed to repay all 93 million only by selling the jersey of Cristiano Ronaldo in 2 years. So in 2 years, Real Madrid had sheer profit of 92 million euros just by selling Ronaldo jersey, which is like a lot of money. I mean, huge part of obviously profit for football clubs, especially the regional ones who have global football clubs. Third thing I want to talk about is like match day event. So when you're playing your home game, you're selling tickets and fans are paying to watch you and you get them, right? So I think that what's important to say in this aspect of sports is that it has a lot greater impact on smaller clubs than greater ones, right? So like greater ones, as we previously talked about, attract a lot more sponsorship, a lot more of those kinds of deals, TV deals, etc., etc. So they do not have to get much depend on selling tickets. So what big clubs often do is you see that the prices of tickets are even lower than the profitable for them to send because often they want to just market themselves as fan-based friendly football clubs, right? They're not economically dependent on sending tickets. They know they're going to send them either way, and they get tons of money from all the other stuff. However, for smaller and poorer clubs, this is like very significant like amount of revenue they get. So, for instance, me coming from Serbia, where we have a huge problem with hooligans. I know that, for instance, when FIFA or UEFA bring suspensions to our clubs, like we cannot have fans for 5 home games, and like that is like a huge economic hit for annual events for football clubs. So for instance, if you just let's say 7 or 8 football games, you're not allowed to have fans entering the stadium because like it may be dangerous and there is some kind of penalty for bad behavior. It is a huge hit for you. It's not while we're talking about like great football clubs down to for richer countries, etc. And not at all that much affected by it. Fourth thing, obviously very important, that dynamic between the region and poor sports institutions is transfers. So poor club develops great players from their youth academy, 21, 22 years old or even younger, turns to be an amazing player, and then all of a sudden Real Madrid comes up and says they're offering you 200 million euros to buy these players. Yeah, obviously this is like huge importance for smaller clubs to be able to develop good players and then sell it. This is basically how smaller scale football clubs survive. Right? You see, Southampton or any club moving to Europe or any weaker club from Spain, as soon as they create good players, they just sell it, and then the circle of life and how football goes. Fifth thing that I want to talk about is like TV deals. This is really huge and it's really important. Right? So for instance, so Premier League made 3-year deal with one Chinese television. It was worth 560 million pounds for 2 years, right? So basically, the Premier League sells the rights for certain stations to play Premier League games live, and then they give a lot of money to Premier League, but even greater, which I'm pretty sure it's like the greatest in the history of sport. Is 3 years, 5.1 billion TV deal that's also like Premier League with Sky Sports and BT Sports, and it's only for 3 years. Right? So in 3 years, Premier League is getting 5.1 billion pounds Um, but the most important thing about TV rights deals is that around 95% of the money deals generally goes directly to funds. So it sounds right to rebut and say, yes, but TV deals are not as important because like, there are like other people who are earning money, for instance, like, the Premier League, and etc. That's basically not true about the majority of TV deals because like player unions have huge bargaining power, it's fighting their interest for clubs to get futures, so clubs earn enormous amounts of money from these TV deals. But also important note for TV deals is that they're like the market for TV deals is quite restricted, right? So for instance, the British Premier League may earn tons of money from TV deals. However, like French football league may not have that strong TV deal at all, right? Because the time spent is limited, you don't have that much time to watch football at all. And like TV stations are generally more interested in like stronger things and stuff like that. So I think one often that people tend to make like these big arguments, right? If we have like this kind of a distribution, this is we're going to have so good TV deals for small leagues, for Eastern Europe, where we have so full football clubs. I think the responsibility here, they're probably not signing TV deals right away because nobody wants to watch, I don't know, Serbian or Bulgarian football league, but there's so many other football leagues that are better, more interesting, etc. So important also TV deals as part of this microeconomic point of football clubs is that they're very valuable for big leagues. We'll talk about the NBA, National Basketball Association, USA, or NFL, National Football League, or Premier League, or Champions League. Enormous amount of money. When we talk about smaller, not that much. But there's not that much interest in that, so they sell their TV rights for a significantly lower price. Like the sixth point is new ownership group. Like when someone buys football club, buys stocks, when they pump up more money into it, and that's how value football is generally created. The greatest example for that is Chelsea Football Club, as well as Manchester City. To a certain extent, Manchester United, right? Someone comes up, buys football club. It's very straightforward. Seventh thing is the prize money. And there is also a big distinction between rich and poor clubs and how this affects. So for poor clubs, prize money, yeah, what I mean by prize money is, for instance, if you reach the semi-final of Champions League, you're getting, let's say, 10 million euros for the club. Or if you qualify for Europe League in football, you're getting 5 million euros just by the fact that you're qualified, right? If you win Champions League, you get, for instance, 16 million euros. If you win the final, you get 10 million euros, etc. So obviously, this is a huge thing for smaller clubs, and this is not that all of a big deal for big clubs, right? Because when you look at the fact that you're earning like 200, 300 million euros or pounds annually based on the sponsorship, even if you win Champions League, you get an additional 15 million, so that's not as much of a difference. However, if you're like a football club from a poor country, they're a poor football club, they just qualify for Champions League, they get 5 million euros out of it. That means that the problem is that you're not going to be forced into selling one of those players which are so significant to fans, or that you're not going to be in debt, you're not going to have to take huge loans, or you're going to be able to afford to buy another player, or you're basically consequently going to be able to get that sponsorship, etc. So prize money as the economic aspect of the club is usually very, very important for small clubs, not at all important for not important for rich. And the eighth one is like the eighth microeconomic point that is important for football clubs and sports clubs in general is like them having these big summer tours. So for instance, Manchester United have summer tours playing games in China, or Chelsea has a tour playing games in the United States of America. They go to the other parts of the world, but they have huge numbers of fans that they play games. So how these contracts are usually made is that um, usually the football clubs themselves get the money from the countries or from the certain companies that are going to get revenge for sold tickets, and then clubs go and for a random football game for a month in China, get tons of money, which is also like a great opportunity for individual sponsorships or for individual football player who performs brilliantly there can sign a contract with Chinese sports companies and like secure basically himself financially for life by doing that. Generally opening new markets, etc., etc. This is also like pretty straightforward way of how this big club that filled with superstars. Um, yeah, the thing with superstars. So why have I talked about all this stuff is that the same way when I'm talking about how football matters to people, and you should have that always in your mind when you have football motion, you don't have to think about it, try to make those arguments that much. You should also have like these 8 aspects of the economic aspects of football when you're thinking about it. However, the toughest part again is how you're going to link that to what motion demands is, right? Whether it's going to be distribution, commercialization, nationalization of the football club, you're going to have to link to these things specifically. So for instance, you have commercialization motion. There is obviously a huge point to be made about that. Sponsorships out there. So important. They're so big part of the revenue. But then again, like there's an answer that which is like, yes, but it affects only like top 5 or 10 clubs in Europe, or 10 clubs in the world, and they get disproportionate advantage. And if they don't have it, we have more equal football, we should have deeper diversification, blah blah blah. So, like if you talk about saying about merchant, like Cristiano Ronaldo jersey in 93 million euros in 2 years. So basically, what you have to do when you get promotion, have these things in your mind, and think about which of those may fit your case best in terms of what is specifically demanded for you to make the motion. The salary cap motion, the negotiation motion, compensation motion, they're going to be different things. So these rules are fairly easy to be made. I just think it is going to be a lot easier to be made if you would have in your mind that okay, you have 8 huge economic aspects of huge economic aspects. Now we're just going to very specifically commercialization, and there is another huge economic aspect of football, and that is how football is a normal business in itself, completely outside of that football pitch, right? Like it affects many people, it creates enormous amount of jobs, just creates enormous value in the economy. So these are like, for instance, 7 aspects that I think being a fairly reasonable to in the base. So one big aspect is infrastructure. So the building the stadium, the facilities, basically stuff like that. It just worth a lot of money. It's a lot of jobs. Like, so just medical stuff, coaching stuff, taxes, stuff. When you think about all the jobs created in youth academy. I think interesting like how much value is created by the fact that we have that much of a transfer between places and where people are going. We have agents, we have managers, we have these few people working with like sports journalism, like all this other stuff. Like it is affecting many people who have nothing to do with football. And I think that is also a very important part of playing when we're, for instance, if you're regulating football, redistributing, you can obviously okay, this is going to decrease the number of investment in football, they're going to get motivated, but there's going to be a tragedy of the commons, poor clubs are not going to have incentive to be that good because they know they're going to get a lot of money from the distribution and also like the big club. Because the issue is that like ownership of the football clubs are usually billionaire people who have many other businesses, and at the point at which football stops being that profitable and someone to invest in, you're probably going to invest somewhere else. Or you're going to have less and less in general, right? So when you're making that kind of organization, which is fairly easy to be made, obviously because of the motion, I think one of the better ways to frame how that's important is that football affects a lot more people than you think first flies that it affects, and there's so much value in the society, economically, that we should not regulate it, or we should not we should like celebrate it. It's so commercialized nowadays, or private, they're profit intensive, they're so awesome. Because you got positive returns from that, rich people are getting richer. Basically like left wing versus right wing representation, right? Also, important note for this economic stuff is that I'm just giving you the context of it to also link these things to motion. For instance, if football is not commercialized, it's not going to affect infrastructural projects in football the same way as if you have radical institutional development on clubs, or in the same way you nationalize sports clubs, right? It's going to be a bit different mechanisms. So you can just think of them more in the prep time and have these things on your mind when you see the motion coming. So this is regarding this economic part of football, giving context about. And the third aspect I want to talk about is the players, right? People who are like most involved with leave by playing sports. So I think the way you frame the debate, if you want to go that direction, like the labor right direction, it is important for players to have as much money as possible. Goes this way, right? Playing football, investing yourself in your extremely young, is enormous risk. So you throw away your education, your parents put huge amounts of money into your potential football, basketball, water polo, whichever sport career. Like just because you think that you're talented, you give away so many other things in life, but yet only so small amount of people have a success. So think of it this way. So for instance, Serbia is like very good at playing basketball, right? Basketball is our national sport. And you have like junior, youth national teams, like for instance until the age of 60, until the age of 40, until the age of 18, 21, and so on. And our national teams, and we have youth national teams, are very good. Like winning European championships, winning world championships, like always getting some kind of medals and so on. So when you think about it, at every point of time, there's like at least 50 young players who are elected to play for their national team, their youth national team, their own country. However, like maybe one of them is going to be great professional basketball player, but all those other people are not going to be that good, and they're not going to earn that much money. However, they probably, if they reach the level that they can play for the national team, wasted so much of their life to that point, right? So huge waste, right? Like your players see that you as a 16-year-old are elected to play for your national team, probably if you're very talented, you just want to push you even more, you want to push yourself even more, so you're opting out of like other stuff which may be very valuable for your life. At the end of the day, you end up as 24-year-old, unemployed, wannabe professional basketball player who doesn't have any education and is probably not in the right way of having like very successful career, earning money for his family, whatever. There is one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is that professional sports players, professional athletes, are extremely injury prone. And injuries can end your career just like this. All we have dreamed about it all. So if everything we have talked about realistic field, and you manage to be So good pro basketball player, play in some European league, like earn let's say $1 million annually, um, and you just break your leg or break your arm or torn Achilles or any other like significant major injury you have, your career is basically completely ruined. You're not going to be able to earn any money playing that sport. You will also not have any other education. So what you're going to do is life, right? And the third aspect of it is that professional athletes' careers are very, very short. So I think on average, like professional athletes have like stops playing sports at around the age of 29, 30, due to many factors. Your body just can't keep up with the intensity of your sports, becomes so professional, so intense, obviously injuries, stuff like that. So when you think of it, even though like someone may say in debate, yeah, but look, like even the smaller clubs earn more than like the median wage in the country. Like even if you play in, I know, third English league football, you're still going to earn probably like around £10,000 a month, and let's say £100,000 a year. You're still going to earn that only by the age of 30, which is like crazy when you think about it. You're going to have basically another 50 years to do something with your life and to earn somehow money, but you do not have proper education or anything like that. So yes, we have big problem with that. And so like these players are for those reasons so important. I think it's also like important piece of training for for players is that I think people sometimes like tend to forget or disregard just how bad players' conditions were, let's say 20, 30 years ago in most sports, how athletes did not have any mobility or any freedom they have now in most sports. So, for instance, there is like interesting case that was ran from 1970 to 1976. It was a National Basketball Association, NBA. It was a case Oscar Robertson versus NBA. So the issue was that in 1970, there was no that concept of free agency. You were completely linked to the basketball publishing draft. So if you were drafted by, let's say, Milwaukee Bucks, Milwaukee Bucks is going to be the top that completely decides whether you're staying or signing, right? So that guy filed a lawsuit, which after 6 years he won, as it was, I don't know, somehow violating some labor rights, don't really matter now. And that is when NBA introduced the concept of free agency into sport, where actually players can determine their own destiny. However, even in 1976, there was not full free agency established. It was only so-called restricted free agency. What does that mean? If you play for a certain club and some other club offers you, like you have 5-year contract, and that 5-year pass, and for instance, Chicago offers you $5 million a year 4-year contract, your club still has the right to match that offer, and if they match it, they still have like exclusive right to sign. Only like 15, 20 years after that, like the full free agency concept was introduced. So I think what people tend to forget is that how players' unions struggled historically, and were fighting for any kind of mobility of sports. Like you can say the same thing about football, obviously, 30 years ago. I think that was like the aspect of mobility for players. When you think of it, it's very important, right? Where do you want to live in? Which city do you want to live in? Stuff like that. Very important for overall happiness for people who have basically dedicated their life to that career. Huge benefit if you have more power in determining where you're going to play. So the context of that may be like, for instance, commercialization motions, when you have the players who are big stars, like enormous stars. In basketball, maybe now LeBron James, in football, Cristiano Ronaldo, and those kind of people. It is very important that we have these kinds of superstars to gain disproportional amounts of power, because these superstars ultimately have a lot greater bargaining power over leagues who can sometimes different incentives with players to provide them for greater social mobility. Greater social mobility, bigger contracts, or for instance, like abandoning salary cap, greater paycheck, whatever may be important things. I also think like important piece of frame of why football players should earn that much money is that when you think of it, like your career may end tomorrow on the training when someone accidentally hits your knee and you get torn Achilles and basically your career is over. It is very important for you to have that kind of security. And put it that way, playing football is extremely dangerous job, which is very dependent on your body. So it's like so important to have greater security. So that's like the third big aspect of sport, of debating sports that I want to talk about. The same as with previous two, you should always have this frame in your mind, you should always say, but it definitely applies differently to different mechanisms of creative motion. Again, commercialization, commercialization, redistribution, any type of any type of sport functions. So for instance, you can just say, oh, it's going to be less money football, and consequently, we're going to have less salary for players, and that's bad because it's the most important stuff in debate. And this is how it's affected. So for instance, football will be less commercialized, we would have less of like individual sponsorship deals, which like the players for players gain some money to gain more mobility and independence because their clubs were owned by rich billionaires who have like very bad incentives with the people who are coming from poor backgrounds. Okay. So just have this in mind and try to make a way to emotion. The most important thing the most important thing about sport emotions. So I think these are like three most important aspects of debate. I think the two aspects of sport emotions which often appear are fairly easy to like to show that the significance of the impact of them is not that great. Racism in sports is the quality of it, like how good the football is for basketball is really going to be, are like more easily are easily outweighed by one of those two. Whatever whatever you want to choose. Right? Obviously, you can also choose to run all three aspects. If you're going to be open half, you want to cover like the most material, you can cover everything that you have previously spoken about, but often you cannot, right? So I think a good strategy in closing cards would be try to pick one of those and try to make very, very strong case of why that's so important and understand. It's not. So all three things that we're talking about can go on either side of the house if you're regulating football. All fans are going to be more satisfied because we have more balanced league, all fans are going to be dissatisfied because they're going to have less money and they're going to have some implication of that, or they're going to have something because they have less money to go to harm players, or no, it's not going to harm players because intensity of sport may be lower when it is less commercialized or professional, so injuries, for instance. Like there's so many things that you can just play ping pong with these small points that we've been talking about, but the important thing is to have those three big concepts whatever you think is easier for you to. So after this, so yeah, it's been a little more than enough. So now I want to talk about another three concepts in sport debates, which I do not think happen that often, but I think they may happen in some occasions in sport debates and maybe of some importance for some. So these three are like charity and politics of athletes. Second one is about politics and hooligans and how like generally sports can be big political issue sometimes. And third one, which I actually encountered two times only, is China. China specifically. So let's get straight. Right? So football players and their political views and charity, which is how much money people go. So um, I think it's like, I mean, obviously many people know that athletes donate like enormous amounts of money to charity, and I think it's like fairly easy explanation of that could be in debate could be that like very often athletes come from poor backgrounds because it's like very risky like a professional athlete. So when you look, for instance, you look like structural NBA players, so like multi-millionaires, literally 90% of them came from very poor backgrounds, really tough childhood. Same when you talk about top football players. When you look at the childhood of Messi or Ronaldo, everything very poor, you know, people, very poor backgrounds. Football was their life, or basketball was their life. So very often athletes have pretty good information about the world and how it's very difficult to live if you're very poor. Just few just few notes on that. For instance, LeBron James, who don't know, probably at the moment the most famous kind of basketball player on earth. Like it has net worth around $1 billion basically. So just in 2016, he donated around $50 million to a single project. The goal is to help African American community in Ohio, uh, like specifically kids going to top colleges in the United States. So like there's this crazy amount of money because there's $50 million only in 2016, only on that one project regarding education of African Americans in Ohio. Right? So I think there may be certain debates either about charity or about sports where you can use what we use this example. Right? For instance, like any debate which is about generally people having more information. I think it's like athletes being very charitable and very good depictions like when people know how tough other people live, they're more likely to donate money. And the other thing I want to talk about is recent trends that like athletes and sports is becoming increasingly and rapidly more liberalized. So just a few examples of that. For instance, there is a boxer called Manny Pacquiao, found in Minnesota, who's famous in the boxing world. Um, so basically, he had some comments which were very offensive towards LGBT community. I can honestly remember what he was exactly saying. It doesn't really matter because it's very offensive. So the Nike canceled after that WUDC. I mean, they had a clause in their contract which was about those kind of comments. So they canceled the contract, which was like $80 million value. So that guy was like apologizing for weeks after that, doing that, blah blah blah. I think like his comment was something oh, there is no place for LGBT boxing features in world of boxing. So there was like crazy amount of backlash in sports. It's not like you're reading a Guardian article which is saying oh, this guy was an asshole, but rather the sports community was extremely judging of him and like 90 years of contract with him get up lots of money facing that. And there's also a big trend in the NBA league, like players having like players having like huge political incentives on issues such as gun ownership, racism, general poverty, let's say. There was like this huge project about many NBA players including WUDC, which is like community work, like some kind of community work between police and African American communities that these NBA players came from. So for instance, last summer, many of them came back to their hometowns and had like created like some huge summer programs where police officers and people who actually live in these communities were hanging out, playing sports, playing some games, having competitions, having lunches together, creating art together, stuff like that. Like, like this huge program that happens out there. Also, there's like a huge, there's a huge program that is pro LGBT rights in the States. For instance, so NBA wanted to host an All-Star game in Charlotte, which what state in Charlotte? Doesn't really matter. So just for piece of context, All-Star weekend in the NBA is it has like enormous value. It's I think it's like top three sport events annually, like greater than football. I think there's only NFL Super Bowl that actually getting more value than the All-Star weekend. And the NBA commissioner at that time, I'm not sure, David Stern or Adam Silver, who was, decided to cancel the Charlotte All-Star weekend and to move it into North Orleans because of the bill that was presented by the state that Charlotte is located in. I'm sorry, I can't now remember which state it was about. Basically, the bill was like it was the anti-transgender law that was adopted. I remember it was all over the news. It was very like some very offensive acts proposed by the government, which included things such as banning them from using bathrooms, basically stuff like that. So NBA got pretty pissed off, and also it was not in their interest apparently to solve the also leaking that they decided to move. But the implication of this is that the city of Charlotte lost lots of money because this event was because this event is canceled. So honestly, like I'm not sure why this trend is becoming so strong. Like the athletes worldwide have so much more liberal values than they used to be, and how like the communities are working all together. But I think that even though like this thing it's hard to imagine the debate that would be like so significant about it, except for like all athletes not taking political views, which is another thing. I think it's just the good example of how advertising and marketing is like has a tendency to be a bit very liberal. NBA canceling that event, or Nike having a clause in their contract where they made it money about like racial slurs or offensive comments to like LGBTQ people, etc. So like that's one aspect which I think may be useful in some sports debates or in some other debates as an example. So second thing I want to talk about is about politics and how sports mostly involve in a political issue in some countries. So what I also encountered in football debates happening is that people like nationalization, these counts with nationalization that we debate about. And opening up was running a case which was basically, look, like, even if it brings many other benefits, there are some countries in which this can be horribly misused. I can use examples of Eastern Europe, socialist communist regimes, and how that worked out. So, piece of context. In many countries in Eastern Europe, I think like most of post-socialist countries, governments still either partially or to an extent own the biggest football clubs. It's obviously not every football club in every country, but it is a trend that still exists. Government runs football clubs. So the reason for that is that it is a great political significance, right? It would be like a political suicide for some situations. If you want to privatize those clubs, like a blasphemy, if you want to do that. People generally expect their state to pump money into these football clubs. However, problem comes when you look at old state-run football clubs. For example, in my country, they're horrible, right? So the same reasons that you can say taking competition apply also to football club. For instance, Red Star Belgrade, which is the largest football club in Serbia, was around 40 million euros in debt 2 years ago. I would say there's updating on this. Because kind of like people don't really know how much they how much they're in debt right now, so they're in a horrible financial situation. Like, I think it can still be a political solution to privatize it. I think that may be important context for some other debate. Um, um, yeah, but also like this is also like I think most of like is like the political links and political ties between fans, especially freedom groups and ownership groups, whether it's government or mostly government or also some private on football. Just a piece of frame or example we could use. So for instance, Serbia's ruling party, uh, called Serbian Progressive Party, which is kind of pretty oppressive, like that media and all those kinds of stuff, but it didn't matter. They had like recently they had like the huge gathering in the city center because presidential candidate won the election, doesn't really matter. And there were like journalists from like media that were critical of the government appeared on the line and wanted to ask some questions. This was framed in the way that they wanted to revolt, blah blah blah. But the problem was that these journalists were like brutally moved from the event. So they were like people with the security guards holding their necks, beating them up, kicking them. It was pretty brutal, right? And there were also like there was a footage and there was also photos of that. Obviously, unfortunately, nothing happened with it. However, yeah, the security that was dealing with the journalists were actually the official security of the party. One research journalist tried to research who are these people who they were doing, and they discovered that those people were very, very famous hooligans who were partisan Belgrade football club fans of during that who were involved in like enormous criminal activity those previous times. So, like violence, attempted murder, armed robberies, like chaos in the stadium, having weapons, using weapons, mass violence, horrible, horrible stuff. So when you think of like people who are literally like criminals, and everyone knows they're criminals, the judiciary system was not able to prosecute them. Balkans, Eastern Europe, right? Not the good of institutions, are the ones that are so tightly connected with the president of a country, which may enter European Union in time span of 4 or 5 years. It's a very scary thing to think about. So I'm not sure if that works in other countries in Europe, but I can imagine that it does appear in the countries which have similar institutional problems as Serbia, or post-socialist countries which also have the high rate of violence at the football games. There is like this strong interconnection between the leaders of criminal groups who are creating absolute mess and violence in football games and other and politics. Like also there is a trend in international football clubs that politicians are taking part in managing football clubs. Like for instance, like our former prime minister was also like vice president of Partizan Belgrade. So they're also pumping money into clubs. Like it is generally a huge political thing in some countries. Football, for general, is a huge political thing, and in the countries which do not have that strong institutions, which are completely horrible when you think about all the interconnections, right? Also, like stuff with hooligans and fans. I think there is also like that microeconomic point that these people also work based on economic incentives. There's big market, like international market of like products and stuff that that these guys are selling to each other things. I don't know how you call it technically. The stuff they're burning the stadium and all that. Like, there's a huge amount of money involved, and many of these people were later convicted of also dealing, for instance, dealing with kind of thing, also like the investment and stuff like that. So I think there are debates and you may be able to use them, probably not the majority of those debates, but just how football can be problematic. But also like if someone tries to run an argument, for instance, nationalization, right? Nationalizing football. Someone from the outcome and says, yeah, but now people are going to use football for political issues. They're just going to get the votes on it, and they're going to vote on real stuff. You can also have a very valid response, which is, well, if people care that much about football, then let them vote based on football. Perfectly legitimate thing to vote about. If you care about it so much that is the reason why you would vote for one person and perfectly legitimate thing to vote about. That can be like sometimes things can be a bit like not analyzing point at the end why it is so problematic. There is like there is a political link between the football and governance or timing or whatever. So I think that if you're running that line, that is how you should run it. Huge problems will be there, so interconnected. You have that circle of crime, which is never going to be solved. And the third thing, like the most minor things that I want to talk about, is football in China. So the reason I'm saying this is also two times. Once the debate was the salary cap debate, and second time I was the redistribution debate. There was the issue how someone ran an argument how China is going to basically buy a lot of European players, and there's going to be this bullying of football, basically China-phobic arguments in football. So the trend was that Chinese government started putting tons of money into football, which is also, as far as I know, political issue there. I know that the president was talking about football and all. So yeah, they started pumping a lot of money into their clubs, and they obviously began to buy a bit older, a bit washed up, but certainly like former superstars that were playing football in Europe for tons of money, large sum. So some people were scared of it now since they're so financially dominant, they may buy off many of those players. However, there was like a recent policy implemented in China, which said that there is a 100% tax on foreign players transfer. This literally means like if you buy a player for let's say 100 million euros, you also have to pay another 100 million euros to a fund. So basically, the reason they imposed the policy is that they were thinking that paying that much money to European clubs for washed up stars because they were not the first one to play in China is like more actually bringing more benefit to European clubs because they're earning basically a lot of money, nothing. And Chinese clubs are spending tons of money for players they never do well. And like consequently will be financially efficient in the way they do business, and that's the reason why. So if someone now brings up the point about China, I just think that's like valid technical response to that point, but it's not an issue anymore, even if that's a problematic at first place. So basically, I managed to put everything in an hour and a half. Just at the end, I would like to sum up. So when you think about sports motion, think about like mistakes people make. One, they talk about lots of stuff. We talked about lots of stuff. So it's only sponsorship is like one huge single argument. However, what people do not do in sports debate is frame why that thing is equal. This is why often like closing us with debate in sports motion. This is framed like, okay, that's true, but equally is more important. So when there are debates, millions of things, just pick one thing and explain why it's more important than others, not necessarily that much by the point is true. And the second one is that people just do not link the concept to the specific motion. So for instance, the concept we were talking about, like, oh, we should care about flares, like birds, stuff like that. Is it legitimate or is it not? So less money, more money, flares, more money, less flares, more money, less money. People just do not link it to the motion. So for instance, in commercialization motion, people may just grant something but never link it to commercialization, even though that's not that a problematic thing to do. So I think you should have those concepts in your mind and just trying to find things. But thirdly, and I think most importantly, is that you should not be scared of sports motion, because like I think all the stuff we were going through, but not as much about sports, right? It's about the economy, and it's about like making very basic principles arguments, like do we care about these people, do we care about that, those people, etc. Not about having some very specific sports knowledge. Right? And if you're a sports fan, and I don't feel actually specific knowledge all as much as sports today, because it often tends to turn out pretty well with just running that. Obviously, knowing much can help. So just for the end, I would just suggest that you read the Guardian article, I think in 2014, which means something like financial revenue for all the clubs playing in the Premier League. So they literally like did analysis on how much of what percentage of the revenue is club earning from each aspect of it and what spending money on. It's very interesting to look like at the poor and major clubs how they spend and earn their money. Yeah, different in a very different way. How big of a difference that is even in Premier League, which in general like has the greatest competition. Also, if you're interested, you should definitely read Guardian because they have excellent stuff. So hope this helps to some extent. Why you can ask me